translation. Jeremiah received the Lord's word. Stand near the gate of the Lord's temple and proclaim there this message. Listen to the Lord's word, all of you of Judah who enter these gates to worship the Lord. This is what the Lord of heavenly forces, the God of Israel, says. Improve your conduct and your actions, and I will dwell with you in this place. Don't trust in lies. This is the Lord's temple. The Lord's temple. The Lord's temple. No, if you truly reform your ways and your actions, if you treat each other justly, if you stop taking advantage of the immigrant, the orphan, the widow, or if you don't shed the blood of the innocent in this place or go after other gods to your own ruin, only then will I dwell with you in this place, in the land that I gave long ago to your ancestors for all time. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Thanks be to God.
So a week ago, Amy Forte and I went to Tucson for a border education and immersion experience along with Jenny and 7 others from Denver area UCC churches. And I expected it to be emotionally, spiritually, and physically exhausting, and ding, 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 it was. Except that it wasn't really. Those words and much more must be reserved for those whose home country is so dangerous and desperate that they would mortgage their house to pay the cost of a coyote to guide them across the most inhospitable stretch of the border possible, and as many times as necessary. These words, emotional, spiritual, and physical exhaustion, must be reserved for Alicia, who told us about her life as a volunteer for No More Deaths. The No More Deaths is a ministry of First Unitarian Church in Tucson that places water, food, socks, and blankets along trails used by migrants. These volunteers are criminals for providing such humanitarian aid. Our group walked along those trails for a few miles, carrying gallon jugs of water and cans of food with a pop-top, listening to helicopters fly menacingly overhead. So my image of walking a migrant trail through the desert was a dry, flat, sandy plain, but the Sonoran Desert is mountainous and sends people through winding, narrow canyon washes, past bushes with stickers and thorns an inch long, and mostly at night to avoid detection. The description of emotional, spiritual, and physical exhaustion must be reserved for people like Lizzie from the Florence Project and other advocates and attorneys who provide free legal services. Always more need than there are people to help. The description of emotional, spiritual, and physical exhaustion must be reserved for Josh. Josh is a U.S. citizen and a member of the Tohono O'odham tribe. The tribe whose land is a vast stretch of the border. And actually, families were divided by the border when it was imposed upon them. So Josh told us about being stopped at interior roadside checkpoints. It's not the border. For lengthy and sometimes physically abusive inquiries of his citizenship, which happens to him 50% of the time he goes to and from work or to pick up his children from school. Children who have to watch as men with guns rough up their father. The description of emotional, spiritual, and physical exhaustion must be reserved for Manuel, who spoke to us from the Mexican side of the border. First, however, we walked along the U.S. side, a tall, see-through steel fence covered in 5 thick rolls of razor wire. I had some pictures out in the narthex for you to see some of these things. Surveillance towers high above. I can report that the rolling terrain of this section would not be sufficient or would not allow for alligator or snake-filled moats, at least here. but not jokingly. Manuel did show us a spot on the Mexican side where Jose Antonio Elena Rodriguez, a 16-year-old boy, was indeed shot and killed in June 2012. Shot 10 times by a Border Patrol agent for throwing a rock toward the wall. An impossible distance for any rock to fly. Agent not held responsible. Manuel's daughter Maria welcomed us into her home in Nogales, fed us a delicious meal, and told us about working 10 hours a day in one of those NAFTA-inspired maquiladoras, making medical equipment for $9 a day. The cost of living in Nogales is so high that if we lived on the equivalent of her salary, a carton of eggs here would cost us $14. And a liter of milk, $29, a 36-pack box of diapers, $136. And yet, when migrants are pushed across the border, whether they're from Mexico or not, Manuel is among the first to offer a sandwich to a hungry fellow human being. We listened to Carolina tell her frightening story. She's a transgender woman placed once in a detention center with men, despite her pleas. And I can only describe her whole life as a series of unspeakable horrors, and yet she turned that around and used it to help others and started an organization called Mariposas Sin Fronteras, which means butterflies without borders. And it provides housing to other LGBTQ detainees when they're released, just as she needed when she was. The description of emotional, spiritual, and physical exhaustion must be reserved for Eden and Oscar and Guadalupe, who we watched as they shuffled into the courtroom in shackles. We watched more than 70 men and women stand before an Operation Streamline judge for 30 seconds each in groups of 10, most charged with a misdemeanor of 1325. But Ramon and Angel and Juan Carlos and a dozen more were charged with what's called a 1326, which means they were charged with a felony for crossing a second time. So when you hear about rounding up a bunch of felons who are crossing the border, I mean, that sounds pretty ominous. Oh, they're felons because they tried twice. Thousands pushed through, 80 a day, in Tucson, or in Nogales, only Nogales. So in Iliff Professor Miguel de la Torre's book, Trails of Hope and Terror, one young migrant told him, "Please tell the Americans that I am sorry for entering their country like this. Please forgive us, but we are simply desperate." We often hear the question, what kind of person would put their family through this? And I wonder, what kind of person thinks placing water in the desert to prevent more deaths should be a criminal act? I went to Tucson with the question, so how many should we allow to cross? And then realized we must first address, how do we treat those who do? So there's volunteers from a group called End Operation Streamline. That's the shuffling of people through the courtroom. Volunteers sit in the courtroom every day to document the daily docket and note whenever there's an irregularity or someone asks for asylum. And then they alert a group like the Florence Project. We saw Crystal, whose horrific description of her life of abuse should qualify her for asylum. And the judge in this court offered genuine sympathy but has no jurisdiction over that. And domestic abuse used to be a factor in asylum cases, as we know, but now it's just as likely she'll just be put on a bus and sent back with never having been given the opportunity to present her case. This devastating experience for Crystal and the dozens more shuffling through the court every day is so normal that we could watch one attorney play Candy Crush on his phone while the other attorneys were at work. And a court interpreter sitting reading a novel while he was on break from the other interpreter. And I have to say, I can't blame them necessarily. I mean, they are trying to normalize their workplace. And must be emotionally, spiritually, and physically exhausting for them too. It's just disturbing to watch. To watch the effects of the criminalization of desperation and the militarization of our border. And agents are caught in the middle too. For example, they used to be able to call no more deaths for help with an injured migrant, but they're not allowed to anymore. And we learned a lot about the factors that contributed to this humanitarian crisis, and much of it was anticipated as a result of NAFTA. Because our government knew that local economies would be devastated. So they created a strategy called prevention through deterrence, which is to push migrants, desperate migrants, further into more dangerous territory. A policy designed to, quote, make migration more treacherous, more criminalized, more cartel-driven, and more politically fraught. De La Torre told of Ignacio, who said he knew the danger, and he said that's why migrants sometimes will pin their names and pictures to their clothing in the event their bodies would have to be identified. He described it being so hot that his brain felt like it was boiling. But if they don't die from heat or an unintended injury or infected blisters, they can die in the desert from drowning during the monsoon season. So the description of emotional, spiritual, and physical exhaustion is not mine to make. And as much as I still want to blame the current administration, to assign it the status of a villain, our country, through both parties, has a long history of cruel abuses against immigrants, much of it driven by racism through such explicit acts as the Chinese Exclusion Act, or the law in the 1920s that required immigrants to know English, but exempted Mexicans because we needed their labor, until we didn't need them anymore and new laws were passed to target. Ranchers along the border are tired of finding bodies on their land. Some resent those coming across. Others, like Joseph, who still referred to migrants as illegals, said he's a patriot, a veteran, and a proud American. But the Bible is clear. Therefore, he's always welcome to whoever knocked on his door looking for food and water. His house is very close to the border, and he said when you turn the lights on, it's like a lighthouse. But he said, the law says I can't bring them inside my house because I can be charged with harboring illegals. That was a dilemma faced by Reverend Daniel Grudy. He passed by on the road as a man waved empty water jugs in the air with his hand, saying obviously he was in need, but the good Reverend did not stop. If the Border Patrol pulled him over, he reasoned he could be charged with aiding and abetting illegal entry into the U.S. and face between 1 and 10 years in prison. As he kept driving, the story of the Good Samaritan came to mind. And then he remembered Jesus told his followers that when you don't help someone who's hungry, thirsty, in prison, sick, and in need, you are not helping Jesus himself. Reverend Grudy didn't turn the car around, however, until he remembered an elderly priest who told him that he saw Christ in the immigrants, calling them the crucified peoples of today. Economic crucifixion as an underpaid laborer, political crucifixion as an illegal alien, legal crucifixion as a border crosser, cultural crucifixion living in a foreign land, and social crucifixion from being treated as less than human by people who depend on them for their underpaid labor to eat. He asked in the form of Matthew 25, what is our response to Jesus, who is hungry in his homeland? Jesus, who is thirsty in our deserts. Jesus, who is naked after being robbed at gunpoint. Jesus, who is sick but can't go to the hospital for treatment. Jesus, imprisoned in a detention center. And if Jesus could make it, estranged and marginalized by citizens who call him illegal instead of human. If we reject Jesus, we reject our religion. There are many texts in Scripture that talk about how one should treat immigrants and strangers, and we've read them here before. Today I chose the prophet Jeremiah, who, as Amy said, He proclaimed, if you truly reform your ways and your actions, if you treat each other justly, if you stop taking advantage of the immigrant, orphan, or widow, if you don't shed the blood of the innocent in this place or go after other gods for your own ruin, only then will I dwell with you in the place, in the land that I gave long ago to your ancestors for all time. Only then will I dwell with you. And I can't help read this text without thinking of the blood of innocent migrants shed on the deserts of our borderlands, or the gods of free trade and stockholder shares that have ruined local communities, turning children into orphans and widows, women into widows. Jeremiah stands at the gate mocking. This is God's temple, this is God's temple, this is God's temple, and he's mocking them for claiming a false security, thinking, we're okay, God's with us, when we're in God's temple. But Jeremiah said true worship is not about being in the right place. It is loving God through acts of kindness and generosity toward others. True worship is a changed life and love for one's neighbor, particularly, as Jeremiah makes clear, the immigrant. For those who claim that the temple is the dwelling place of God, Jeremiah sets the record straight. God will not dwell in the hearts of believers if the hearts of believers do not change. Now, Jeremiah, if you read any of it, he can be a pretty harsh critic. But it's also the way he speaks of hope. Because if we change our ways, God will dwell among us. I mean, that means nothing's hopeless. I mean, it's not a sentence of death. It's an invitation to life, to simply live a life of justice and compassion, like Alicia and Lizzie and Carolina and Josh and Manuel and Maria and Joseph and Reverend Rudy. Now, they may not describe the presence of God in their lives as that which keeps them from succumbing to emotional, spiritual, and physical exhaustion. But it can be the way we keep ourselves going when it all seems too much and we want to give up caring. The opportunity to actually see Christ with our own eyes in Eden, in Guadalupe, and Ramon, and Juan Carlos, and Crystal, and Ignacio. That's a blessing we may not fully appreciate. To see Christ with our own eyes. But that's not an excuse, of course, to keep them on the cross, or to keep crucifying others so we may benefit from their sacrifice. To glorify their sacrifices, oh, they're so brave, is a perversion of the gospel of good news for the poor, liberation for the captive, and freedom for the prisoner. And yet, even so, it is hopeful. The antidote to a life of emotional, spiritual, and physical exhaustion is to experience the indwelling of God. And how? A little criminal activity here and there, such as providing water in the desert, so that there are no more deaths. That and a changed life that stops taking advantage of the immigrant. Then God will dwell within, but only then.